So we're living in a world where organizations are moving their maturity from left to right. When we think of some of those characteristics, we think about increasing agility, boosting productivity, and overall making a brilliant digital experience for our end users. Architects have a key role to play in that, and that's what we'll be talking about today here on Cloud with Chris. Hello there, welcome back to another episode of Cloud with Chris. You're with me, Chris Reddington, and here we talk about all things cloud. Now, thank you for joining. We are going to be talking once again with a guest that has been on the show previously. We're going to be joined by Asanka Abesingha as he talks about architecting the transformation. It's surely going to be an interesting session. You may remember the session previously where we talked about this concept of a cell-based reference architecture. Well, now we're going to be learning even more insights from Asanka in this session. So you know the deal. If you like the content, please hit like, please hit subscribe and hit that notification bell so you know as soon as there is brand new content available to come and listen or watch, however you consume it, no matter which platform, whether it's YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or of course cloudwithchris.com as well. With that, let's go and introduce our guest for this session. It's Asanka. Hey Asanka, how are we doing?
Hey Chris, I'm doing good. How are you?
All good, thank you. All good. Thank you for joining again. We've got the fun time zones to play with again, but we're ready. We're raring to go, I think.
Yeah, it's a pleasure and thanks for inviting me again.
Very welcome. Pleased to have you back. So I guess last time then we talked about this model of a cell-based reference architecture and some of the concepts, how it translates into microservices effectively. And we're going to be talking about something different here. I think it's a bit more of a bigger thought compared with what we were talking about earlier, I suppose.
Exactly, because last time we talked about a pattern, right? Like how you can use this cell-based architecture as application architecture pattern. But here, as you mentioned, it's about the overall architecture and how you can have an approach to face the challenges that you are facing, as well as identify the role of the architect, as well as defining the architecture properly. Because this is a gray area. Like in sometimes when I ask about what is your architecture, I get a deployment diagram or a IT landscape document. So that is what people use to maintain and then refer as architecture. But it's more than that. And then again, it's really hard to define a template for that because it can vary from organization to
Yes.
organization. There are maturity level and then what type of priorities that they have. So idea here share my experience as well as some thoughts on how you can define that framework and then have a agile approach for that because architecture has to be agile too. Otherwise, you can't have a proper agile methodology for the development.
Excuse me, absolutely. And I think that that's a really important point, especially the world we live in today where things are fast moving, things are changing all the time. It's okay to
Yeah.
live in an agile world with your architecture. It doesn't mean you shouldn't have requirements or things like that. I think sometimes people interdisperse those 2 points, but absolutely living in a agile world rather than waterfall is key here. I think I'm going to bring up your slides here because it looks like you're showing some interesting slides here as well.
Yeah. So I think that is where we have to start the architecture. So I will explain a little bit in detail about how this will fit in the overall context. But if you look at it, has to start from mapping the business models into deliverables. And it's a very crowded market because you have to consider certain market dynamics, your competition, and what type of experience that you are providing for your end users. All these things need to be considered when you are building the business models. And that's where this build versus buy argument coming. When you have a unique business model, you can't buy everything. You can buy certain stuff, and you have to build a differentiator. So that's what I have highlighted in this particular diagram. So that's where the architecture will come in handy, like how you can do some integration with the existing or the things that you bought. And then on top of that, how you can build a unique experience is what we have to do as architects in a very high level semantics.
And I think that's a really great point for anyone listening who maybe isn't from an architectural background, or maybe they're new to that architect space, that actually build versus buy is absolutely a great decision to make in any kind of project or any organization. But as you rightly point out there, if you are bringing something new to the market, if you're really truly trying to innovate, as you say, you're not going to be able to buy not going to be able to buy everything, because otherwise, what is your unique selling point at that point? What is your differentiator? What makes you different on that market? And that's a super key point.
Exactly. And with that, I think we can pay some attention to the design principles of a digital-driven organization, because as an architect, you have to understand these design principles when you are getting into the architecture exercises. So the first thing is decentralized. So that's what we discussed in our last discussion about one approach to have a proper decentralized model using cells. And then the lean agile, because agile, again, a very overused term. Agile methodologies itself sometimes not agile enough. So how you can have a lean agile approach that fit into your team and your organization. And then open standards, open source, open culture, open communication, all these things are required in this type of an environment. And another design principle is outside in or customer centric, because it's no point of that we build something that we think that will provide an advantage for the end users. It's better to understand the end user and build something. So that's where the customer centric nature will come in handy. And cloud is it's not a argument, right? Like you need to have cloud native technologies, cloud native engineering practices to leverage all the cloud technologies. And the last point is about data driven, because we have to have a data driven approach at every stage, like when you are defining the business model, when you are building the business architecture, and when you are doing the technology architecture, and even once you release the product, how to get feedback, and then feedback into that particular iterative flow comes with data. So you have to that data-driven mindset from day one. So that's a good principle to have.
And there's a few points in there, like the agile piece, the customer centricity, the data-driven approach, that all really stem back to some of those key DevOps principles that we hear of as well. You know, the using people, process, product to effectively create value for your end users. It's that key part, isn't it? It's your end users. You could keep innovating, you could keep iterating over your products, but if your end users are not getting any value from it, what's the point? You know, there's no point in having that product or that service, because you're not going to be getting business from it, you're not going to be getting revenue, and it's just a nice side pet project at that point, I guess.
Exactly. So with that, I think we can look at how architecture is vital in these transformation objectives. So how I see this, the architecture and the culture is the foundation for an organization. So then it comes, it creates that foundation, and with that strong foundation, you can improve people, process, and technology. All these three pillars that we usually discuss in the methodologies. And then once you have improved people, process, and technology, automatically you get a digital alignment. So that's how I kind of bring the architecture into the overall organization structure and the way these organizations are operating.
Understood. Excellent.
Yeah, and then the challenge will come with how you can identify whether you are improving. So that's where the maturity model will come in handy. So there can be many maturity models. This is something that I authored some time back. And there's a Git repo, this specification released under Creative Commons, so you can access it. And at the end of the presentation, I have put a link to that as well. So in that maturity model, there are different stages that you can see, and you can do assessment and identify where you are. And then you can have a proper plan where you want to be, because you can't transform overnight. It's a journey. So you can plan that particular journey using a maturity model. My best analogy for a maturity model is GPS, because in a GPS, you identify the current location, and then again, you put the destination that you want to be. So the GPS will guide you throughout your journey. You might miss a exit or some kind of a particular road, but then again, the GPS will reroute, right, and then put you on track. So that's exactly what the maturity model doing. But then again, you can't just rely on the maturity model. You have to look at other aspects as well. So as an example, when you are using a GPS and driving, you have to look at the conditions of the vehicle. That's basically the platform or the technology that you are using. And then you have to have a good driver. That's basically the person who's driving the digital effort. And then again, it depends on the people inside the vehicle and their behavior, right? So that's basically the team that you have. And then again, the road condition matters as well. So that can be the culture or the organization structure. And then again, you have to keep an eye on the vehicles that driving parallel to you. That's basically the competition. So you have to have a 360 view to get successful in this transformation while using the maturity model. So that's how I fit in this in the transformation journey.
Yeah, I like the analogy to GPS there. I can see how it resonates across the different pillars there, and I like this diagram as well. As you were talking, I was kind of scanning and just thinking of how this all stacks up, and other organizations I may have worked with in the past, and just placing some of them. And I like this setup actually. It's I think something that's interesting as well that is probably important to call out is you don't necessarily need to be in one of those columns strictly either. Like you could be in one of them for people, one of them for process, one of them for technology, and each of those are probably going to be their own separate journey to a degree, but overall as part of that piece. There we go.
Exactly. So exactly what you said. It's basically iteratively move to the right as much as possible. And then again, some organizations will not move to the rightmost column. They might stay at some point. That will be perfectly fine because that's what that organization required. So that's basically the idea, like how you can kind of iteratively move to the right in this process.
Excellent. Seeing lots of parallels with the DevOps kind of concepts here. Love it. Love it.
Exactly. And with that, we can move to the role of the architect. So I will share a story there as well. So in 2004, based on my experience, I had the title of an architect. But then again, I didn't have a clear definition of what is the role of the architect. And I thought like drawing diagrams and then creating PowerPoint. I used to call them PowerPoint architects now, but those days I didn't have a clear idea. But I was working for this company in Ireland, a suburb area called Wicklow. And when I was at an architecture meeting, this guy called Eric Nadelin, he came to the room and he was the chief architect in that particular organization. And then again, the thing that I saw, like how he kind of navigate the current problems, and then how he communicate inside the meeting, how he used the whiteboard and then used diagrams to communicate. All these things inspired me. And then he told a lot of stories as well within this session and used a lot of visual diagramming. And then I came outside, after the meeting, I saw this guy is doing a lot of coding as well. So I was kind of wondering, the perception I had about architects was you draw the diagrams, create PowerPoints, but it was totally different. So that was kind of the eye opener for me. And then I thought of I want to become a real architect like Eric. And that was kind of the starting point. And I worked towards that. Still, even I carry the Chief Technology Evangelist title. I have a 1 hour block in my calendar for coding. Because I think it's really important to have the hands-on experience, especially for an architect. Then only you can understand the technical depth, as well as you can understand the problems developers are facing. That way you can provide better solutions. So that's kind of an eye-opener for me about the role of an architect.
It's a great point, isn't it? It gives you that empathy into the different levels of the stack as well. Because as you say, I think there's a lot of broad brush thinking of, right, this is the, this is the direction we want to go in. This is the type of challenge or the problem we're trying to solve. And here's broadly how we can solve it. And then it's almost like that typical DevOps chasm where it gets handed over to the development team of, okay, here you go solve that now. I'm going to work on that next problem. But as you say, if you can also focus on bridging that gap, it'll make that a much more seamless process.
Exactly. I think that bridging that gap is key. So the Gregor Hopes, he has a nice definition for an architect. He tells architect is the person who's riding the elevator that connects the engine room and the penthouse, basically the business and the technology. So as you said, like different groups will connect by an architect by riding the elevator. So these are my definition of an architect. So I think architect is a warrior who protect the organization by finding solutions and link business and technology, like we discussed earlier. And another definition is architect has a guide, always like Yoda. So then architect is a curator because he has to work with different teams and then come up with this solution. So that is how I define an architect. So I think, sorry, Chris.
No, I was just going to say, it's actually, when you really look at it and you boil it down, it is a very challenging role because you've got this very broad expectation of you that you can interface with the business, you can interface with technology or the dev teams or whoever. So you've got those relationship skills. You're able to keep up to date with the broad technology trends, what's going on, and then focus in, that T-shaped model we often talk about in the industry, being able to focus on the areas when you need to and where you need to. And not only do you need to communicate with those others, but you need to be able to bring them along that journey then as well and help them understand this is why these solutions or these patterns or these approaches make sense. And here's some of the things I've been doing, mapping back to what you said about getting the hands on coding. Here's then how it goes to the next level and sets you up for that. It's a very, very interesting role, isn't it?
Exactly. So I think the definition of that warrior is really the matching title, I would say. And you can use reference architectures and your experience as weapons when you are going for this war and finding solutions. Yeah, exactly. So I think with that, we can look at the architecture now because we
Mm,
got a clear idea about an architect.
sure.
So some people, they think it's a specification, and some people think it's a diagram. But I think it's not that. Architecture is a value stream generator.
Mhm.
So that's my definition of an architecture. So how it fit into that value stream generator? So this is my view of architecture. So you have the business strategies, and then enterprise architecture is the layer that connects the business strategies into different architecture components. And inside that, you get the business architecture, information architecture, application architecture, and technology architecture that we will go in detail. And that foundation creates a foundation for execution, and then it connects the operation model as well. That's where the traditional IT and different type of processes will come and create that foundation for execution. So that way, like you will have different type of autonomous teams building these products, and as a result you will get a proper business outcome. So the end goal of the architecture is to provide that business outcome by connecting this business strategy into different type of technology elements. And if you carefully look at this diagram, you will see that elevator concept on your left hand side, as well as you have a continuous feedback loop going from the business outcome up to the business strategy. So that way you can improve each and every layer by getting this feedback from different groups.
And there's something really subtle but really important there I just want to pull out as well is that idea of that continuous feedback loop and these different stages. And I've said it a few times, I'll say it again here, that about this similarities between DevOps, and typically we see that chasm between the dev team, the ops team, and because it's just one team handing off to another, there isn't that partnership. And I think that's really what we're
Exactly.
talking about here, isn't it? Is this partnership for the greater goods or the benefit of the business, if you like, and ultimately working in partnership and having this continuous feedback, not one handing off to the other and then business gets something back over time. It's almost, hold on, let's coin a term here. It's almost what ArcBiz or BizArc or something like that. The new DevOps. There we go.
Exactly. Exactly. So I think with that, we can dig in deep into each and every architecture block. So if we first look at the business architecture, it might be a new term for some of the organizations. So this is what I think with the business architecture. So business architecture has to be done by a business architect, not by a business analyst, because if you have played this role of an architect in a project as a technical architect, the documents provided by business analysts are not that useful for an architect. A business architect will create these 200, 300 page documents, but architects will talk to the business people again, gather the requirements, and build the architecture, because that translation of these business analysis documents and technical architecture didn't work in the past. That's where you need this new role called a business architect, who will have a good technical background as well as a really good domain knowledge. So once you have those two capabilities, you can be a really good business architect and define this business architecture. So in this exercise, what we will be doing, basically identify the value streams of the organization and then map different type of requirements, applications into those value streams and define these are the things that we need to build to support the business model that the overall organization is going to have or currently operating. So that's where the business architecture will come in handy. So the supportive roles for the business architect will be the domain experts and the product managers, so and so forth. They will give more insight into the business architect, but he or she will drive this effort in a typical organization. And another thing, now, even some of the organizations, they think they are using iterative approach or a agile approach. They are waterfall agile because of the business analysis process. Because business analysis process, they try to do the requirement gathering end to end. Sometimes it might take ages. So you can't have that process in the new agile methodologies. You have to create this small requirement epics and then define small chunks of requirements and getting into production and go back and gather the requirements if required. So that cycle should happen in shorter intervals that will fit into the sprint cycles that this agile team defines. Otherwise, you will have that lengthy requirement gathering phase and you will fall into this waterfall agile method. So that's where the business architecture is really important in this agile and cloud native engineering projects.
I have a term for that. I call it Wagile.
Exactly.
You're not quite doing one or the other. Mix of both.
Exactly. So we can move to the information architecture with that. So this is about the data. Like different type of data, like raw data, relationships, historical, so on and so forth. And the data architecture is a subset of the information architecture. So that's very important because sometimes architect misunderstand this thing. So that is a key part that you have to define the data architecture as part of the information architecture. It's not two things, those are interrelated and a subset of the information architecture. So this is application architecture. So in your left hand, you will see this centralized layered architecture. So I'm not recommending that. But then again, in some cases, you still have to use it based on the organization structure as well as the application architecture that you have to use. But this is the recommended or the modern cloud native approach, that you have a decentralized architecture with microservices and event-driven type of architecture styles will be used. That's where the application architecture will come in handy on how you build these applications.
And this all stems from that maturity model, really, doesn't it? Because if you don't have that maturity from a lean agile perspective or a customer centricity perspective or some of those other characteristics that you mentioned earlier, you're probably not going to want to take that journey onto the decentralized route until you realize some of that, I think.
Exactly. You are spot on there. Because it's kind of, again, transformation that you will transform from one architecture stage to another. And in some cases, you will use a hybrid mode, like you might run some stuff in the layered architecture and then the new applications in a decentralized manner as well. So that's what we see in typical enterprises. And this is the technology architecture. Basically, in the technology architecture level, you define what type of technologies, sorry, I added a slide, what type of technologies that you will be using, who are the vendors associated with, what type of SaaS applications you are going to subscribe. All these things will be defined in the technology architecture. And then all the DevOps policies, security policies, all these things will be considered in as part of this exercise as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Exactly. So what is the gap now? I think a lot of architects are working on these type of exercises. So what's the gap?
Mhm.
Basically, uh, the 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 messy middle is one thing that I highlight, because people are struggling in the middle. That you have a digital strategy, you have you want to become digitally driven, but how you do that is a problem, and that's where the architects will come very important. That they can help to kind of clear this messy middle by bringing an architecture. And then the most of the architecture styles are layered and centralized. So how you can move to a more decentralized architecture is another thing. And then a lot of people are building shadow IT applications because they don't like the governance and then heavy layered approaches these organizations are having. I think that's where cloud will help, and a good cloud platform will help to standardize some of these things and bring some governance into the picture and allow people to build applications in a defined platform, is what these organizations should look at. And the brownfield, greenfield, those applications are running in silos, but you need to connect these two. And even last discussion, we discussed about the disconnectivity between architect, developer, and the DevOps. So we need to connect those three, as well as we identify the agile waterfall or agile methodologies. We need to get into a lean agile method as well. So those are the challenges architects are facing.
And there's an interesting point on that one, just to pull out a bit as well. You mentioned about Shadow IT, and
Yes.
Shadow IT is nothing new. Obviously, it's been around for many, many years now. But there's something interesting in there where there's an opportunity now moving to this new cloud world, where actually, if there's a reason that those governance models are enforcing you to have to even think or consider shadow IT, there's obviously something there that is breaking that model or forcing you down a certain path to take that decision. And ultimately, that's maybe a basis to start building that partnership and say, actually, we can't adopt this model because of X, and we need you to do Y to help us adopt that model a little bit more and work pragmatically rather than in those silos again. And it's something I just want to call out as actually it's something I was a little bit triggered by when you when you said it, because it made me think of some different areas I've worked with in the past actually, and it's a good opportunity.
Exactly, exactly. So I think we can take a look at how we can fill those gaps by using the model that we discussed. So first thing is about these principles drive decision. So that's where I think we need to pay attention to all these four architecture exercises: business architecture, information architecture, application architecture, and technology architecture. Because what I see, especially people who's working on these digital projects, they are not paying enough attention into these four areas. Even you can have multiple architects working as a group in these four areas as well. I mean, depend on the size of the project and scope of the project. But what I want to highlight is the first thing that to break those gaps, or filling those gaps, is identify and work on these four architecture areas is something fundamental. Um, and then when you are defining the business architecture, I think it has to identify what are the values delivered by your business strategy, and based on those business outcomes, defining the objectives and key results, and get a proper path on how you can feed these different type of initiatives into the value stream is what we are doing in the business architecture. And if you can take a look at the bottom of the diagram, that you will see the concept will break into different categories of value. So that is basically the iterative approach, that you will keep on generating value in an iterative manner and provide these applications into consumption. So that is what we have to do in the business architecture opposed the traditional business analysis model.
And I just want to call out again something on that slide there that you mentioned in passing, but OKRs, brilliant concept, amazing concept. For anyone who's not familiar with them, I recommend checking out a book by John Dewar, Measure What Matters. It's an excellent book. It's something that I've started taking and applying it just in various scenarios. It doesn't have to be about business. It helps you, understand how or the what you're trying to achieve and then the how you're going to achieve it. Really excellent book and excellent model that I can see you've looked at here as well. So I wanted to call that out for folks that may not be familiar.
Yeah, I think I also completely agree. I have the book too, and it's the father of OKRs written the book as well, right? And then the best thing in that book is like, don't use OKRs to measure performance. Because it's not about the individual performance. It's about the overall objectives of the organization and functions. So that's a key thing that we need to keep it in mind when defining the OKRs as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So moving to the information architecture, one mistake architects are doing, they define the application architecture decentralized, but keeping the information architecture centralized. So one thing we have to do, we have to look at the distributed information architecture as well. Otherwise, you will have a bottleneck at the information architecture layer that will not support the application architecture properly. So there are many concepts like data lakes, and then even I authored something called data microdata architecture, and then there's another nice architecture style called data mesh. So all these things are supportive styles that you can use when you are defining the distributed information architecture as an architect.
Got it. Makes complete sense.
Yes. So this is my architecture style on the microdata architecture. And if you are interested, you can refer this URL in the bottom and read it. And then moving to the application architecture, this is an advice as a architect that I am giving you. You have to have a simplified view, because architectures are some of the architectures are very complicated. So you have to start very simple. So I use this method called level 0, level 1, level 2, level 3, like that. So level 0 is a very high level conceptual architecture, and level 1 will have some type of a detailed view, but level 1 doesn't have any technologies in the that particular architecture. And when you go to the level 2, it contains the technologies and additional details like that. It's very important to build that. So assumption is, if a new architect join your team, or you have to explain this to external architect, he or she should be able to understand these things. So building this architecture level by level is a key thing and advice that I would like to give.
The analogy I think of there is almost you're looking at it on your phone and you're doing the pinch to zoom, and you're going into those different levels, the different layers, right, as you zoom in, isn't it?
Exactly. I think that's a really good analogy for that. So the decentralized architecture we discussed in detail during the last session. If you are interested, you can go back and look at the recording about cell-based architecture. So that will explain one way of handling it, and even microservices architecture providing foundational stuff. But this will take you to the next level and make it more pragmatic, how you can use microservices architecture in the real world and utilize cloud technologies, so and so forth. Yeah, so with that, I think we are moving to the operational model, how architecture will fit in into a overall execution model. So this is basically what I do as a consultant when I'm working with these different digital transformation projects. What I advise them to start with the digital steering committee, and in the digital steering committee, you define all the digital strategies by looking at the business models of the organization and market outlook. Market outlook is especially your competition. So with that, you will get a priority list of things that you should do to generate more value, and then you will define set of objectives. Then you have set of enterprise architecture objectives as well. As an example, leveraging cloud might be something, and then having a proper big data architecture, those kind of different type of enterprise architecture objectives you might have. That will be a set of information that you will feed into the next level. Then you will have something called a digital architecture review board that you will define the architecture. So I want to highlight something. Some organizations, they think your enterprise architecture and digital architecture is different things. But for me, it's not that. Your enterprise architecture is your digital architecture. Don't try to define a separate architecture for the digital, because it has to be your enterprise architecture. On this digital architecture review board, what you will be doing is defining the enterprise architecture in an iterative manner. As you see, the ideas coming from the steering committee, you will define the architecture, and you will use the domain knowledge from the one set of architects, and then technology or architecture knowledge from another set of architects, and as a team you will define these architecture styles. As a result, what will happen, you will get a reference architecture for your organization, as well as you will define a pattern catalog. In certain stuff, how you will implement it will be there in the pattern catalog. With that, you will get into the projects and then define or execute these projects and build different type of products. And having an innovation lab will be really useful, because in some cases you can't take a risk, because you have to do business as usual while you are doing the transformation. So having an innovation lab will be really useful, as well as some of the traditional hierarchical enterprises. It will be really hard to bring innovation inside. So innovation lab is a really good concept to bring innovation inside the organization. So this is kind of the operational model that we see in most of these architecture initiatives.
Lots of really good stuff in there. I like the idea of the architecture review boards, and they're almost this group that is able to spot the trends and the themes that are happening over time, and be able to say, right, actually we've solved this problem, or this is a new problem. Let's make sure we document this so we can use it for future projects which come along. And then coupling that with the innovation lab, as you say, I think there's going to be a lot of people who are going to be in status quo mode, but you need someone who is going to focus on taking those few projects and getting them going on that journey, because otherwise you're constantly going to have that battle of when is it the right time? Are we at the right place to go and do this transformation yet? And because you're not seeing those results or anything come from it, it just drags out. And I guess that faith in that process then starts to lose a little bit. So I see the value of that pattern. I like that.
Exactly. And sometimes people might think this is creating a center of excellence team. It's not. So how we perform the architecture review board, representatives from each and every project team, or those domain architects will have a seat there as well. So they have a say. So it's not just a central team taking this decision. They will take the input from each and every domain team as well. So it's a collective decision. So that's how it operates in the practical way.
Yep. Makes sense. Virtual team, cross-functional, makes complete sense.
Exactly. And this is kind of taking it to the next level, how the execution model will look like. And you will have all these DevOps related stuff, and autonomous teams will work inside those pipelines. And these concepts that we built, like the reference architecture, agile principles, pattern catalogs, DevSecOps policies, all these things feed as guidelines and a governance model, and you will heavily use all these continuous integration, continuous deployment, version control, automated testing, those concepts, and keep on delivering these applications. And if you look at the autonomous teams are responsible to plan, build, test, run, and manage these applications, and the entire life cycle of the application will be managed by those teams.
Yep. Makes a lot of sense.
And a few more kind of guidelines for the architects, things that we didn't cover. So first thing is the domain-driven design is a very useful thing that you can use from the business architecture into application architecture and into the technology architecture, and look at the programmability of the your components or the technologies that you are using, because programmability increase the agility as well. And you can create a composable enterprise using APIs. So expose APIs as much as possible, as well as consume APIs as much as possible, because API is the glue in this type of an environment. And we talk about the inside out approach, give priority for the customers, and have a product mindset, because having a fixed budgeted, fixed time project mindset doesn't work anymore. So you had to have a product mindset, because these applications or experiences required to evolve by getting feedback and have that iterative approach. And you have to have this design on the cloud and for the cloud from day one. Otherwise, you can't leverage the cloud technologies properly. So those are some additional points that I would like to share with the architects.
And if I were being super, super picky on terminology, I think I'd even tweak products to be services, because I think products, sometimes people think of like box products. I've released it, it's done, it's out of the way. Whereas this cloud world we're in, it's not really that anymore. We have this great opportunity to keep evolving over time and making tweaks and enhancements, and like you've said a few times throughout the session, Asanka, this continuous feedback and that ability to keep growing and changing over time. That's such a big part of this modern cloud world that we live in.
Yeah, I think it's a great suggestion, and I should update the slide, products and services. Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, so these are some contribution to this concept. So we discussed about the cell-based architecture last time. This is the link to that. And I authored something parallel to that, layered architecture and segmented architecture, because still people using that. So you can refer that from this URL, and the methodology and the maturity model is inside the agile methodology. You can find it from this URL, and then some articles that I wrote, and I continuously blogging in my blog. I name it as Architect to Architect, sharing this architecture experience. So if you are interested, you can subscribe for that. It's a Medium blog. And if you want to connect with me more, these are my contact details that we can connect and have a productive discussion.
Excellent. Asanka, another brilliant session. Thank you for joining and just sharing all of these insights. I think a lot of it resonates with me because I've seen people go along this journey. So as we've been talking, there are things, as you've been talking, I've been able to pull out and map in my mind to various folks and teams that I've worked with, and seeing them on their own journey. And hopefully for anyone who's maybe new as an architect or on their architect journey, and this is all useful insight and information to help them as they grow in that. So I guess maybe as our final closing thoughts here, is there anything in particular that you'd say out of everything that we've spoken about today, this is something you should definitely keep in mind, perhaps.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, for inviting me, and then it's a pleasure to be part of it, part of the show. And my final thoughts are like think as an architect as well as have the hands-on experience, and then look at the reality as well as the complexity of the enterprise when you are working on this architecture exercises, because it's really important to understand and have the breadth as well as depth. Both are required for an architect.
Absolutely. Another excellent show, Asanka. So thank you very much for joining again. Greatly appreciate it.
Thanks.
So here we go, folks. We have been talking all about architecture, all about how you can go and use these maturity models, thinking about these different layers of architecture as well, from the business side, the information side, etc. And overall how it comes together, that maturity model matching those different architectural approaches and partnering with the business. I think we have to take BizArch as a new term, like DevOps, after this session, but you get the idea there as you've been listening in. It's all about partnering, it's all about clear communications and making sure that you have not just that broad view, but that ability to understand some of the nuances and go a bit deeper as well. So another great session there, folks. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. If you have, please hit the like button, please hit subscribe or hit that notification bell. And of course, it's not just YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and cloudwithchris.com as well. So thank you, folks, for joining again. If you've enjoyed that content, please do follow up with Asanka. His details were on screen a little bit earlier. He'll be pleased to go ahead and chat with you folks as well. And of course, check out his blog. But otherwise, stay safe, stay healthy, and until the next one, bye for now.